and I have a story for you. It's adapted from an old story from Scotland. It's a story about a man whose name was Farquhar, and he was a drover, which is to say that he drove groups of cattle to market. And because the way was often stony and rough, he had a staff that he brought with him that was made out of hazelwood that helped him make his way. So one day when he was returning from market, he ran into a stranger who, as you will see, was somewhat of a magician. And the stranger greeted him and said, "That's a fine staff that you have." And Farquhar said, "Yes, it is. It's a hazelwood, and it is strong and stout." And the man said, "Do you remember the tree where you got that staff?" And he said, "I do." "Do you think you could find it again?" "I could that." "Well, if you could find that tree and get me wood for a staff of my own, I would pay you in as much gold as you can carry." Now, Farquhar had never had so much as even one piece of gold, and so this sounded very good to him. "And," said the magician, "if you could do a small favor for me in addition, I would double that amount of gold." And so the bargain was made, and Farquhar set off again for the north. And he found the glen, and he found the hazel tree, and he cut a stick that he thought would make a fine staff, and then a few other sticks besides, just in case. And then he set his mind to the other part of the bargain, because what the magician had said is, when you come to that tree, look at the base of the tree, and you will see a hole. If you watch that hole, snakes will come out. 6 snakes will come out. Brown snakes, pay no attention to them. But the 7th snake will be a pure white snake, and I wish for you to capture it for me. And he handed Farquhar a small glass bottle. Well, Farquhar looked at the base of the tree, and sure enough, there was the hole. And as he watched, sure enough, 6 snakes came slithering out. 6 brown snakes, brown and banded like adders. And so then he took the small bottle and he pressed the neck of the bottle against the hole at the base of the tree, and he waited. And sure enough, out came the 7th snake, a pure white snake. It slithered right into the bottle. Farquhar capped it and set off back to meet the magician. Now, the magician had said, "Tell no one about this errand," and Farquhar didn't. But when he got back to the magician, he handed the magician the hazel stick, and the magician was very approving, thought it would make a fine staff. And then the magician took the rest of the sticks and built a fire and put a pot of water on the fire and added the white snake to the pot. Then put the lid on and packed peats around the lid to keep the heat in. And then he said to Farquhar, "I must leave for a minute, but watch this pot and make sure that none of the steam escapes." Well, so Farquhar watched the pot, and inexplicably, it did begin to boil. And he saw a bit of steam escaping through the peats. And remembering what the magician had done, he went to pack the peats down a little more closely on the lid, but as he did, some of the steam burned 2 of his fingers, and he popped them in his mouth to cool them off. And everything changed. Farquhar could still see the very same trees and bushes, but now he could see more. He could see the healing juices in them rising up, and he could still hear the sound of the birds. But now he could hear more, for he could hear and understand what the birds were saying. Prudently, he decided not to mention this to the magician, who returned shortly. The magician unpacked the peats and took off the lid of the pot, dipped his fingers into the broth and put them in his mouth. And then he frowned. He tried again. He put his fingers into the broth and put them in his mouth, and now his frown turned to fury. He turned to Farquhar and he said, "What have you done? You have stolen the magic." I meant no harm," said Farquhar, "but my fingers were beginning to burn." "Well, you have ruined everything," said the magician, "and you shall be punished." And he pointed the hazel stick at Farquhar and said, "The spell is broken, the magic is flown. May you now be turned to stone." Nothing happened. The magician said louder, "May you now be turned to stone." But nothing happened. "Ah!" said the magician. He was furious, and he threw down the stick, and then he threw the broth and the snake right at Farquhar. He said, "You have taken the magic, you may as well take the flesh in addition." And then the magician stomped off into the tall bracken. And Farquhar then realized that he hadn't been paid the gold that had been promised. But he also realized that perhaps what he had gained was more valuable than gold, for now he possessed the gift of healing. And as he went from village to village and town to town, he realized that he could heal anybody of any illness, even if they were nigh unto death. It was a wonderful gift. And then one day he heard the birds chirping something about the king's daughter who was ill, and he thought perhaps he could be of use. And so he made his way to the castle, and he talked to the guard at the gate. He said, "Is there something wrong? Is someone ill in the castle?" He said, "Yes, it's the king's daughter." "And what is her problem?" "Oh, it's her knee. It pains her so much she cannot walk and can scarcely stand." "Well, surely the king has called for doctors." "Oh, of course," said the guard. "He's got all the most renowned doctors in the kingdom, and he pays them well in gold. And sometimes the king's daughter seems to get better, but then she gets worse again. The king is almost ill himself with worry about his daughter." And Farquhar said, "If the king will see me, I may be able to cure her." So the guard relayed the message, but the king was very reluctant to let a stranger in to see his daughter. Farquhar, however, did not give up. He was persistent. And so for the rest of the day, he walked back and forth in front of the gate of the castle. And what he said was what the birds had said to him: "Black beetle, white bone, black beetle, white bone, black beetle to the white bone." Of course, everyone who heard him thought he was mad. But finally, the king said, "Send him in. I'll talk to him." And the king said, "What is it that you're saying? Black beetle, white bone. What does that mean?" He said, "If you take me to your daughter's chambers, perhaps you will see." And so Farquhar was led into the room where the king's daughter was lying on the bed with her knee bandaged in huge bandages, and she was moaning in pain. It almost broke his heart. The king said, "What can you do?" And he said, "Well, let me see." So he unwrapped those bandages, and what was revealed? A deep wound, and in the wound, a black beetle. The king was horrified. "Oh, what is the meaning of this?" he said. "Well," said Farquhar, "you pay the doctors, but you pay them too well. It is in their best interest to have your daughter be ill so that you continue to pay them their gold. And so they've placed this beetle in her wound where it may feed on her flesh and cause her great pain. But they don't wish her to die, for then you would no longer pay them the gold either. So sometimes when she gets very ill, they take the beetle out and she seems to get better and better, but they don't want her to recover completely. So they put the beetle back in the bandages." Oh, the king was furious. And so he immediately decreed that all those doctors should be beheaded. But someone had warned them, and they fled the kingdom before that could happen. Well, now Farquhar was taking care of the king's daughter, and twice a day he went in to remove the wrappings, to treat the wound, to rebind the wound. And the two of them, the king's daughter and Farquhar, began to talk, and they grew quite fond of each other. He was kind and gentle, and in no time at all, she was completely cured. The king was very grateful. And he sent for Farquhar and he said, "You have cured my daughter. Name your reward. What do you want? Gold, jewels, land, power." And I imagine it will come as no great surprise to you that Farquhar said, "I do not want gold, nor jewels, nor land, nor power. What I want is your daughter's hand in marriage." Well, the king thought about that, and he thought that maybe it would be pretty good to have a son-in-law who was a healer. And so Farquhar the drover became Farquhar the healer. And when he married the king's daughter, he also became Farquhar the prince. And the king's daughter and Farquhar lived long and happily ever after. And that is perhaps the ending that you were expecting. Quite satisfying, isn't it? And yet, there is another possibility. Is it possible? I think it is. That when the king said, name your reward, that Farquhar said, I don't want gold or jewels or land or power or even your daughter's hand in marriage. What I want is the black beetle. Because you see, Farquhar had looked at that beetle, and at first he thought it was Eulomoides dermastoides. But then he looked more carefully at the antennae, and he realized that it was a subfamily that had never been seen before. And so Farquhar the drover, who was Farquhar the healer, became known far and wide as Farquhar the entomologist. And he was world renowned for his many studies about beetles and their practical uses. And that is the story of Farquhar and the snakes, a story from Scotland.